I'm here today on behalf of my role with Immigration Partnership Winnipeg. But I'm going to talk a little bit about my role with the City of Winnipeg briefly. So the Citizen Equity Committee is mandated to advise the Mayor and Council on equity and diversity issues as they impact on the City of Winnipeg policies and services. And that's how I ended up working closely with Abdi and Immigration Partnership Winnipeg. Winnipeg named 2016 the Year of Reconciliation, and we now have Journey of Reconciliation as an ongoing development of peace and understanding. One of the things our committee did was we created an Indigenous Leadership Invitation Guideline. And this is an example of how to actively engage the First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. And we wanted to effectively and respectfully invite them, know how to invite all of these different leaders to city events and who should speak and in what order. And we have 7 Treaty 1 chiefs, and we have various First Nation and Métis political organizations. And so what we did is I actually talked to about 15 different Indigenous leaders, and we got together, and kind of like the Google Doc idea as well, we had the acknowledgement to the territory in Winnipeg vetted. Every preposition was edited by all of these different leaders, and we came up with the order of who speaks and who to invite. And there's Anishinaabe, Dakota, Dene, Cree, and Métis in Winnipeg. So it was quite a challenge, and one little piece of advice is patience and time, and just find out who the leaders are in your community. If you don't know, find out the unique and different cultures, and then go out and invite them and talk to them. The Indigenous Relations Division at the City of Winnipeg is continuing to work on the TRC action items. Number 43, UNDRIP, number 47, doctrine, number 57, training, 75, cemeteries, and 77, the records on residential schools. One of the other initiatives that I'm involved with the City of Winnipeg that lends itself to building bridges within our city is UNESCO's Canadian Coalition of Municipalities Against Racism and Discrimination. And it's one of 7 coalitions that compose the UN International Coalition of Cities Against Racism. I'm sitting as a vice chair on a national committee that's revamping and revitalizing this initiative. So anybody in municipalities, or you want to push your powers that be to get involved in this, there is a 10 commitment challenge that you sign up with, and in the next year or 2 we are probably going to do some rebranding and stuff with that. But one of the 10 CMARD commitments that is important for my involvement with Immigration Partnership Winnipeg is promoting respect, understanding, and appreciation of cultural diversity, including Aboriginal and racialized communities. One of the initiatives that I worked on under this for the City of Winnipeg is a Know Your Neighbors Guide, and in some of the very first editions of it, there was no Indigenous content at all, and it was very much based on identifying the newcomer communities and doing a little write-up about the cultural organization that existed in Winnipeg and where to find resources. So when I came on, I said, okay, that's not going to work. So I redid the book, and I'm going to tweet out the link to it because it is available as a PDF, and it was included in Canadian UNESCO's report internationally last year at a global report as an initiative for cities and municipalities to do. Indigenous Winnipeg. There is 84,000 Indigenous people as of just census data released last month, which makes up 12.2% of the population, and it is the Canadian city with the largest Indigenous population. There also is 93 different ethnic groups that have a population of over 500. So this makes a very diverse inner city, and together Newcomers and Indigenous people make up almost 50% of the inner city's population. And these areas are also associated with higher rates of crime and poverty. As many of you realize, there is an us versus them mentality with many stereotypes and information, especially in the youth category, especially in the inner city where we have seen a lot of challenges. In 2014, Immigration Partnership Winnipeg conducted research on newcomer needs and community assets and held conversations between elders, community leaders, parents, and youth from both communities. And I'm going to talk about some of the daily challenges that were mentioned from the Indigenous and the newcomer youth. And what often precipitates the aggression is discrimination, poverty, poor neighborhoods, language barriers, social isolation, loss of self-identity, loss of status, and loneliness. Conflicts between these two youth have become a very serious concern. I'm going to quote directly from the report because I think we all talk about the stereotypes that exist, but I want to actually say them. And these are statements from the report about how newcomer youth and their perception of Indigenous people: violent, abusive, gang members, irresponsible, on welfare, not involved in the community, alcoholics, druggies, and most of the girls involved in prostitution. Aboriginal youth respondents also indicated that they didn't know much about the history, culture, and places of origin of the newcomers. And they showed more tolerant perspective and generally saw newcomers as people needing support to adjust to life in Canada. And language barrier was a huge problem in hindering their interaction. The Indigenous youth also seemed to view racial tension, though, from all sides. And not just from newcomers. And so the defensiveness that comes across from a lot of Indigenous youth are viewed as newcomers as standoffish, and they don't want to be there. But part of that is because they've experienced racism from all Canadian inner city areas. They both saw their vulnerability, challenges of social inequality, cultural oppression, and loss of identity as common. They did have some good recommendations on how to make creative, positive relations and cross-ethnic pairing in after-school programs and sports, summer youth camps, sharing their cultures in the form of food, music, storytelling, and dance to create a better understanding. And both youth groups cautioned that if nothing is done to bring the youth together, that the division will continue to grow and might result in clashes in the street or even more youth joining gangs for protection. But most of them were optimistic and sympathized. Adults in this study had fewer opportunities to meet and work with individuals, and they held fairly strong views of why there was a distance between the communities. It was competition for housing, jobs, and services. The elders in the communities were the most understanding of the social situations being experienced, and that they actually had a lot in common. So where do we begin fostering relationships, eliminating stereotypes and negative perceptions? So part of this, out of this research, Immigration Partnership Winnipeg created the Indigenous Newcomer Engagement Sector Table, and we started that in the fall of 2016. I was asked to join on that, and there's about 12 people from both communities, and we came up with 5 priority areas. That IPW can work on: partnership and advocacy, public relations campaign, policy, so supporting the oath of citizenship, and there's lots of work being done on that, so we can check that mark off our list. An education tool, but it would be more like an orientation curriculum for newcomers on Indigenous people, reconciliation, history, culture, and social issues. So we're really interested in what other places have done, but part of our trying to figure out when do you talk to brand newcomers in their programs about residential schools and the colonial impacts of poverty and systemic racism. So when do you do that? You know, and so that's been our challenge, that we've kind of gone back to like establishing an Indigenous consultation circle, because what we realized is that we needed a little bit more of a straight Indigenous voice instead of the Newcomer Indigenous table was good for idea generating, but then we needed that stronger voice. So we're just now in the process with IPW of getting about 10 people together from academic, elders, youth, different genders, different communities, Métis, First Nation. And so that's, where am I? Yeah, I went off topic. So what I've just mentioned here now is what I know, a little bit about what the City of Winnipeg and Immigration Partnership are working on. There was a lot of grassroots people, organizations, collectives that host events regularly to build bridges within these communities. I'm going to let Abdi talk a little bit more about the fun stuff and the events. My final word that I wanted to say is that it may be contingent on immigration and newcomer service organizations to make the first move in creating opportunities of dialogue with Indigenous people. But building relationships with individuals, Indigenous individuals first is key. You can't automatically assume that Indigenous governments or political organization will be as passionate about these initiatives just because they're finally invited to the table. They have many pressing issues facing their own communities that demand a lot of their attention. And so there is work to be done on both sides of this conversation. And working within First Nation, Inuit, and Métis societies and organizations and communities, like I said, first find out who they are. Don't homogenize them all into one Indigenous group. Find out exactly who their cultural is. Find out who their leaders are. Not just, like it's the community leaders as well as the formal leadership, the chief and council. That would be my advice. And take your time, have patience, meet with them for coffee, get to know them one-on-one before you want to drop on like, hey, do you want to be involved in this great thing? It's going to take some time and energy away from your other pressing issues. So now I'm going to pass it over to Abdi. And I've already said all that. And he can talk more about the events and so on stuff.
I wanted to talk just very briefly about this slide. At the Immigration Partnership Winnipeg, we recognize the fact that newcomers and Indigenous people are settling side by side and have little knowledge of each other. So our priority number one as a local immigration partnership is to enhance bridges between Indigenous people and newcomers. So that's a priority for us as a cornerstone of what we do as an organization. So the first thing that we came up with was to have a slot reserved for an Indigenous person to sit on our council permanently, and then have an Indigenous sector table, which is chaired by Maria. And then right now, as Maria talked about, establishing an Indigenous consultation circle. Why does this thing go off? Indigenous consultation circle composed of elders, leaders, and other community members. One of the projects that I want to talk about, because we talk a lot about young people getting involved in gangs and having to have this discord amongst themselves, is something called Youth Peace Building Project, which is running in its 7th year, involved with a couple of different organizations. The idea of getting together youth to create the building blocks of coexistence amongst our communities, because youth has a lot of mistrust for each other. Elders have the same, and families have the same kind of thing. So why can't we have kids getting together? For example, when we come to the camp, the kids initially at the beginning talk about, oh, I don't want to stay with that dirty native, this ugly language that kids talk about. And the Indigenous kids are saying, like, these immigrants, they're taking over everything, we don't want to do. And then 7 days later, they're loving each other and hugging each other and saying, oh, I miss you, and all these kind of things, which is very beautiful. In its 7 years of going, kids who started are now leaders and all this. And the idea, it talks about, faith, coexistence, tolerance, what's hate, what's stereotyping, and all these kind of things, and how they can work together. there's more improved coexistence. There's quite a bit of trust for each other in terms of working together. In my last slide, I wanted to just talk about a few other initiatives. One of the things that we're working on is something called Indigenous Orientation Tool for Settlement Service Providers. We recognize that a lot of newcomers who settled in Winnipeg have very little information about Indigenous people. I'm glad that the citizenship guide is going to include more resourceful information on Indigenous people, but there's more that needs to be done because citizenship guide happens 3-4 years after being in Canada. So we need to have something when newcomers come to where they're coming, where they are settling, as well as enough information on their orientation abroad document. So there's a need for this kind of robust information in orientation tools when newcomers settle in their place of settlement, as well as even before they come, the Canada orientation abroad documents. Us as Immigration Partnership in Winnipeg, we have no power over what happens with the orientation abroad document. We leave that for researchers and as well as Citizenship and Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada to do something about it because that's quite important. For us in Winnipeg, we're developing this tool where settlement service providers as well as language service providers can deliver this tool to their programs, to their organization, participants and all this with specific ideas on how to work with Indigenous people, understanding Indigenous history, as well as also looking at building the capacity of the Indigenous community to come and deliver the content of this tool itself, rather than someone who doesn't understand doing it. The other thing is constantly we have a group that's led by Indigenous youth in the north end of Winnipeg, which have developed something called Meet Me at the Bell Tower. Every Friday they get to meet at a bell tower in the north end to go against violence and issues of hate and all this. And once a year they do a Newcomers Welcome event, which we collaborate on, and we gather whole communities together. We had a Syrian Welcome event. We had Indigenous people and elders going to the airport to welcome Syrian refugees and drum for them and sing for them. We had a welcome event for newcomers once a year where we both have welcome for newcomers who are from outside Canada as well as Indigenous people who are new to the city, so that we can all celebrate together and see our commonalities and not the difference. We also have a project that involves land-based education, which has brings newcomer youth to Shoal Lake, which provides water to Winnipeg, but itself, the First Nations over there does not have its own potable water. So educating newcomers about this problem. And the last thing is also waiting to see what happens with the oath of citizenship. And one of the things that we encourage amongst our settlement service providers and newcomer communities and ethnocultural communities is a true recognition of treaty obligations in community events. So everything that you do as a protocol start with recognizing treaty recognition. So I'll end there. Thank you.